Ladies and gentlemen, I feel that the revolt is not a peasant's revolt, it's a speaker's revolt. I was lured here under the pretext I was going to have a good dinner in a magnificent room with delightful company, which I've had, and that was it. And then people like this say, stand up, talk, speak for your supper. But then why not? Because we're here, I suppose, to try to do something with this site and this building. And I've been seated here, directly opposite Henry VIII, that rather debatable king there, and equally in line with Edward VII, that equally debatable king, who, by the way, if you look at it hard, although he was only about 5'5", was reinvented by flattering portrait painters as a mini Henry VIII. If you look at that with the beard, if you look at a portrait of Edward when he was a young man, he is goggle-eyed and manifestly retarded. And the only way they could actually make him look faintly respectable was to persuade him to grow a beard and, as it were, embrace his stomach. And you will see this way, as Edward's portraits develop, he is increasingly made to look like Henry VIII. It's a completely deliberate strategy, and it works rather well. There's a much more serious point here. Henry VIII's reign represents, as was briefly hinted, a great crisis in the history of this institution, when it nearly died. Founded in the reign of Henry I, in the reign of the last of our Norman kings, perhaps appropriately by a jester. That curious quality of the serious and the solemn, by somebody who had made a king laugh and made his fortune and got ill, and I suppose, like Billy Connolly, suddenly realized he'd got it all wrong. You know, the characteristic response of the comedian throughout the ages. And he founds this great hospital. And remember, what we have here, despite the nobility of the buildings, the scale and the so on, is a mere fragment of the medieval structure. St. Bartholomew the Great, which is the church which lies at an angle to this building, I trust everybody here has been in it. Please do. It is the best surviving Norman church in London. But, ladies and gentlemen, it is a fragment. That church, which seems so large, is merely the chancel. It's merely the altar area. What you think is the churchyard is the nave. What you go into from Smithfield, which looks like a gateway, is the former west door. So you've got to envisage this structure, which would have been well over 300 feet long, which, remember, is only half the length of medieval St. Paul's. This was a city of supremely great churches. And then here, stretching the whole of the way along Smithfield, there was this huge hospital built for the poor. Now, again, we've got to be careful. Nobody came here ever expecting to be cured of anything. You came here expecting to die in decency and the odour of sanctity. Now, whether much has changed, I'm a historian. I couldn't possibly comment on today's medical politics. But anyway, but of course, it is fundamentally a religious foundation, as Oxford and Cambridge are, as all the other great London hospitals are, as the great foundations for the poor that were established by Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, like the Hospital of the Savoy. And when Henry VIII, who, remember, it's wonderful, the reign of Henry VIII is both the beginning and possibly the end. And we are in that uniquely privileged position of sitting looking at it, but also perhaps experiencing it finishing. Because Henry VIII, ladies and gentlemen, is the first Eurosceptic. Henry VIII is the direct antecedent of Nigel Farage. You laugh. He broke from Rome. He broke from the Treaty of Rome. And if you look at the debates between Henry VIII and Thomas More, who is another great figure of the City of London, he's Sheriff of London long before he has anything to do with the King or the Council. His is a great London family. He's brought up as a London schoolboy. He goes to school a few yards from here. His whole world is encompassed here. Thomas More's debate with Henry VIII is a debate about the nature of the sovereignty of the English Parliament. Is the sovereignty of the English Parliament absolute? Or, as he says, because in those days, those who were found guilty in court were at least offered the opportunity of explaining why the verdict is wrong. Wouldn't Max Clifford have enjoyed that yesterday? But there we are. And Thomas More, of course, who is the greatest lawyer of the day. Can you imagine presiding over a bench that condemns the greatest lawyer of the day, and then he has got an absolute right to answer you? And More says, no, I cannot be condemned by this law because this law is wrong. It is illegal. It is ultra vires. And you can see the Lord Chief Justice sort of raises an eyebrow, and the Lord Chancellor, who is as ineffectual as most Lord Chancellors, and no exceptions at all, the Lord Chancellor turns in a state of desperation to the Chief Justice and says, well, what shall we say? And Thomas More continues, this law is ineffectual because the Parliament of England is only a parish council. The laws of Christendom are the laws of the common body of Christendom. And the common body of Christendom is the General Council of the Church, presided over by a pope, and the laws of Rome supervene the laws of England. You know, that's exactly the same debate that we're having now. Then the answer was simple. The Lord Chief Justice, in those days, judges were allowed to swear, even when they were not women, and he swore his regular oath by St. Julian and said, if it's an act of Parliament, it's good enough. And on that, of course, the entire structure of the medieval church collapses. England, remember, in the Middle Ages, is a country most of whose law is made in Europe. All the law governing economic activity, all the law governing contract, all the law governing wills, all the law governing marriage is church law. The only thing the state deals with is property, real estate, and criminal law. The entire area of social, economic legislation, and of course, it's increasingly important, the regulation of thought, PC, medieval style, except then we didn't pillory people in the Guardian, we burned them at the stake just outside the door. In Smithfield, it's not clear which is the more unpleasant process. But all of this is reversed under Henry. And again, the medieval church was immensely rich. Roughly a third of the land of England is held by the church. And that land is seized by the king in one of the very great first early acts of nationalisation. We've had 4 in English history. The first, of course, is the Norman Conquest. The second is the enormous confiscation of the monasteries. The third, actually, is the confiscation which nearly took Oxford and Cambridge. 10 years later, the confiscation of the chantries. And the fourth, of course, is what the Labour governments of the 1940s did, which included the estates of this hospital, which had survived Henry VIII. Henry VIII nearly took this hospital down with him. He is persuaded not to. In so doing, and this is really important, in so doing, Henry and his daughter, on this wreck of the religious bequests of the Middle Ages, remember, we're all talking about charity. Every will in the Middle Ages included a bequest to the church, which would normally have encompassed between a tenth and sometimes as much as a third of the estate. It was regarded as proper and your pathway to salvation. Now, what happens? Once you reject the Catholic Church, why did people leave so much money? Were they holy? Well, I suppose a few of them were, but the essential notion was you were going to buy your way to paradise. That money paid for prayers that would be said for you to get you into heaven. And it's done in I noticed very distinguished bankers opposite me. It's done on the principle of the church's treasury of merit. The idea was that the church had contained Jesus Christ himself and the saints who'd been so much better than they need to have been, that there was what was called a treasury of merit. The church was in fact sitting on a great deposit of virtue that was entirely superfluous to get those people into heaven. They'd laid up so much treasure in heaven, it could be redistributed to those of us who were less effective at saving ourselves, of course, in return for money. And it was actually sold in return for money, which is why these bequests are made. What the reign of Henry VIII and Elizabeth does, it nearly destroys all of it. And then it does something, I think, of crucial value, that reshapes the entire Anglo-Saxon world. It invents the idea of charity. The idea that giving isn't simply to save your soul or to save your skin, but it is to do good socially in very particular areas. In education, in the care of prisoners, in the care of the sick, in the care of the poor. And those definitions of charity, which were worked out between Henry VIII and the Great Charities Act of 1601, have governed the whole operation of charitable giving on both sides of the Atlantic. The American tradition of philanthropy is shaped entirely by that concept, not subverted by the welfare state. I'm sorry, that's why it's so strong there and why it's so weak here. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, facing now the problems of the ideas of 1945 and 46 running into the sand, that there is no longer that huge pot of money that will keep these things going. We're having to revert. We're having to go back. Whether it is entirely satisfactory that we use Henry VIII as a moral model, I am not sure. But that's where we are, isn't it? It's painful. But it also forces us to ask questions. What is the place of structures, of buildings like this? Why do we try to keep them going at the same time as having a modern hospital around them? Why does my Cambridge College try to keep distinguished architectural structures going, whilst at the same time, we're off manipulating elaborate mathematical formulae in dreadful slums, built by famous architects for too much money in West Cambridge? What is the relationship? And ladies and gentlemen, I think there's a very simple answer. It's called sentiment. Do we have any feeling for what that very great Whig, who became an even greater Tory, Edmund Burke, called the social contract, which he talked about as being the bond between the past, the present, and the future? And when you're here, when you're in a room like this, and you're looking everywhere on these walls, there's a monument to what people have given. There's no shame. There's pride in giving, in noting it down to the last penny and the last halfpenny. There's a pride. But equally there's awareness. And look at them, the dates, everywhere. There's a sequence of dates. They're aware they're part of a sequence of dates, that they're standing in time, that they'll die quite soon, that this may be a monument and a memorial of something that they've actually done. And it does seem to me that in this age, our 24/7, in the perpetual restlessness of now, that sense of past, present, and future matters. And it's a particular glory of a place like this, that it still educates, that it still trains, that it takes the expertise of the doctors of one generation, it gives it to the present on the assumption that they will train their successors in the future. That matters. And the stability of this architecture, of its distinction, matters and is a kind of visual representation. It's our duty, I think. I hesitate to use that word. It's now one that people sort of shiver about. But I think it is our duty to make sure it's not a burden, but that privilege is actually handed on, handed down, and remains intact. For God's sake, if it survived Henry VIII, can't it survive David Cameron? Please.